After the events of the past year or two, the Black Lives Matter movement, a pandemic-era rise in hate crimes towards Asian Canadians, the Islamophobia that we saw earlier this year in London, Ontario, well, the conversation around racism has changed, and people who want to make a difference are looking for answers. Educator Shakil Choudhury has spent the past 20 years working on just that, and his new book offers lessons for us all. It's called Deep Diversity, a compassionate, scientific approach to achieving racial justice, and it brings Shakil Choudhury back to our airwaves tonight from the Danforth in Ontario's capital city. Shakil, it's great to see you again. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Steve. A pleasure to be back here.
Excellent to have you. Well, occasionally we get nostalgic on this program, and it occurred to us that you haven't been you talked to my co-host Nam Kiwanuka a couple of years ago, but you and I have not sat down for a chat in 6 years. So why don't we start with a clip from that last interview that we did back in 2015. Sheldon, if you would.
What's really important to recognize is that our implicit bias, if we are not able to detect it, if we're not able to catch it early when the costs are low, in this case the cost was personal embarrassment and the fact that I'm sharing it with you, then under stress and time pressures, the consequences may be greater. So for example, I'm a doctor and I don't know that my biases are at play at this unconscious level, then I may undertreat patients, which is what a lot of the research shows. If I'm a police officer and I haven't recognized that I've got biases towards certain groups of people, I may use excessive force, and then tragedies, as we're seeing south of the border, because police officers are seeing, because they're stereotypes, threat and danger where there isn't any.
So that was us talking unconscious bias back in 2015 after your first book came out, Deep Diversity, Overcoming Us versus Them. You have apparently decided there is more to say on this. How come?
Well, for a number of reasons. One is that when my book came out in 2015, Donald Trump hadn't showed up on the scene, and Donald Trump has changed the conversation about what's happening and the level of polarization. That was one of the factors. The other factor is that I think it took me about 6 years to grow into my book, meaning what I wrote down, I then took to the US and across Canada, and I got both accolades and challenges on it, and I felt like that was important to update. And also the last thing is that society's finally ready to have a conversation about the most important part of the book and of all the work that I and others do around issues of racial justice and equity, which is to have a conversation about racism in its systemic forms.
That suggests that you think we have made some progress on the issues of unconscious bias and systemic racism today versus 6 years ago. You think that's true?
I think to some degree. I think that there's more awareness, for example, around issues of unconscious bias. However, overall, there's more openness to understanding systemic, and I think that part's really important. I'm seeing more organizational leaders showing up saying, we don't know what's going on, we really need some help. And these are leaders at the highest levels. Now, that wasn't quite the case half a dozen years ago. So I'd say we've made some progress. However, I think we are still stuck at this really important and difficult place about separating overt forms of racism from systemic forms. And overt forms are awful, but easier to identify. We know who we have to challenge with overt racism. It's the racists. But with systemic forms of discrimination, we have to confront ourselves, because all of us can recreate and reinforce a system in which people of color, Indigenous peoples, Black people are systematically undertreated by our words, our actions, and our outcomes. And so I would say that that's the work that I've been trying to do for 25 years, and that my peers in the justice frame have been trying to do. And that is the toughest thing, because it's very emotional. And I think that we really have to start working and dealing with the emotions underneath, which is part of why I really am encouraging us to develop emotional literacy in this work, because all of this work around bias is emotional.
Well, you wrote about some of these issues in a column in the Globe and Mail not too long ago, and I want to read an excerpt from that. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this up. Systemic discrimination isn't intuitive unless you experience it directly, and only becomes widely visible through data analysis. Various studies show that resumes submitted with white-sounding names such as John or Jessica can have a higher chance of a callback for interviews than those with names like Jamal or Jagdeep. We may not even be aware we are acting with this bias, something any of us can be implicated in regardless of skin color or identity. To address such racist patterns, we have to confront ourselves. This is tricky because self-interrogation makes many of us feel defensive, angry, or ashamed. My experience and research demonstrates that emotions are critical to facing the racial equity puzzle. Yet as a society, we don't do emotions well, nor do academics, the de facto leaders of social justice work. So much to pick apart there, Shakil, so let's start here. What do you mean as a society we don't do emotions well?
Well, we are here in Canada and the US. We follow the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant norms. And white Anglo-Saxon Protestant norms, there's nothing wrong with them, except when they become the dominant norm that everyone has to function by. And within the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant frame, we have a very narrow band of emotions. And so as a result, we don't really pay attention that much to emotions. And we tend to prioritize thinking over feeling. And all the research, in fact, shows the opposite, that we are not rational creatures. We like to believe we are, but we are, in fact, emotional creatures. And us starting with that as the beginning is actually really most helpful. So emotions are the driver. In fact, neuroscientists would say that our next thought is based on our last feeling, whether we're aware of that feeling or not. And feelings are at that emotional level. And so we have to bring emotions into the room because they're already in the room. So what we need to do is learn how to dance with them, our own emotions and the emotions of other people, because they're having the greatest amount of impact. Whether we like to pretend that emotions aren't in the room, whether we'd like to keep them out of the room, they're profound. And people are feeling big things, especially when we're talking about issues of race, gender, and identity, because it touches us at this core level of survival, whether we're aware of that or not. And so the emotions get really big. So what we've got to be able to do is become more emotionally intelligent and develop more emotional literacy while we're developing the political literacy to help us understand issues such as systemic racism.
Well, I wonder if you'd make that case, because EQ is not something every person has. Obviously, some people have a lot more of it than other people do. And obviously, as well, a lot of people have done very well, thank you very much, in society, be it in the corporate world, in the public world, and they don't have particularly good EQs. So how would you make the case to them that they need to up their EQ, even if they have been, quote unquote, a success in their world?
Well, emotions are invisible and controlling according to the research. So for example, one of the classic experiments is 3 strangers sitting in a room facing each other and not saying anything. And within a very short period of time, in some cases minutes, all 3 people share the same mood. And the mood is transmitted by the person who's the most emotionally dominant, the most emotionally expressive. And this happens without talking and without any prior history. So that is a function of how we are wired. We are mammals, and our nervous systems are wired to co-regulate, which is why work teams can be in a time period, and someone in a meeting can have really negative energy and drop the whole team down, or have really positive energy and keep them up. So emotions matter, and especially matters for leaders. So we can try to ignore them, but emotions are in the room and they drive our behavior. So ultimately, if we're not aware of them, it makes us reactive. When we become aware of them, it makes us responsive. And the more that, in my work and research, that when we're dealing with issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice, that when we give more space for emotions to be present in a way that is regulated in a room, where people are given permission to be okay and even touch their name their emotions, we're just more successful. People are much more willing to talk about the difficult concepts in a way that's compassionate and thoughtful, as opposed to reactive or shut down.
Okay, let me ask you about power dynamics. And to that end, I want to ask you about an expression that we hear all the time these days, and that is white privilege. And I want to give you a scenario here, and I want you to help us understand, well, just to get inside it and help us understand it better.
Sure.
I suspect a 58-year-old West Virginian former coal miner who's just lost his job, who's white, is going to have a hard time understanding that he enjoys white privilege.
That's right.
While a 25-year-old, and again, I'm plucking this example out of nowhere, but a 25-year-old South Asian software engineer who lives in San Francisco and makes 6 figures a year is somehow hard done by. Explain.
Right. Well, you've got two things happening there. One is that we've got to understand privilege more broadly. And understanding it broadly means recognizing that there are many identities that we possess. In the coal miner example, you're talking about someone who is working class. And we know that there is class privilege that they do not benefit from. And in the context of the software engineer, that may be brown and earning more money, that they struggle with being marginalized because of their race. So there's racial privilege or racial marginalization that's happening there. Now, these two things don't have to compete. What we have to be able to do is look at the realities of both of these things. And I think that the mistake would be to dismiss the white coal miner. The reality is that class is a big deal. And we should talk about class privilege and how they don't benefit from that. And also within that context, also make it more complicated, because as much as there are white coal miners, what about the coal miners of color? And how are they doing in that context? Let's have a conversation about there and see how race and class come together. And then when we're talking about the software engineer, well, the reality is that we know that Silicon Valley is still predominantly white. So as much as we might think that East Asian or South Asian tech folks should be doing really well there, they're not. So let's have a conversation about what's happening there too. So I don't think we have to pit these against each other. I think what we have to do is recognize that we benefit from different parts of privilege. So for example, for myself, yes, I've experienced internalized racism. And yes, race can play out in subtle ways, from stores and cottage rentals to neighborhoods. That these things play out in very subtle ways. But I also have a lot of class privilege. I'm here talking to you because I wrote a book. That means that I'm at a particular class of upper middle class. So to believe that the only thing that's functioning for me is race would just be a huge problem. The idea is, what are the different identities we possess? And understanding them and being thoughtful about them, not just holding on to one or the other, but becoming more fluid. And again, the ability to become fluid is emotional. And to be able to see the patterns is also part of that.
All right, let me follow up with this. In the areas of unconscious bias that we talked about earlier, and the excerpt I read from your Globe and Mail piece, if an employer or if a landlord is a person of color, do they experience, or can they experience, the same discriminatory unconscious bias against, and let me use the names you used, against a potential employee or tenant named Jamal or Jagdeep than they would against somebody named John or Jessica?
Do you mean, can they be on the giving end of racist behavior?
Yeah, can they be just as racist in their presumptions about Jamal and Jagdeep versus John or Jessica as, say, a 55-year-old white male employer or landlord?
Everyone can reinforce racism. So what I would say is that I, as a person of color, because of decisions that I make, can reinforce racism. My words can reinforce racism. My actions can reinforce racism. So no one's clear of that, because we're talking about systems. At the same time, if I'm a landlord or I'm a boss, I can also experience racism coming to me from employees as well, because there are just ways that there may be I may be taken more for granted. People may feel like they can challenge me more than they can a white boss. So I want to say that all of our actions and words, regardless of our identity, can reinforce racism and sexism. I tend to stay away from words like "you're a racist" or "you're a homophobe," because that becomes an identity, and it feels like identities can't change. But when we talk about our words being racist, our actions being racist, well, we can change our words and actions to be more inclusive and more thoughtful.
Understood.
I just want to make that.
Gotcha. Okay, let me follow up with this. If there's one thing a white person does not want to be told, whether it's that 58-year-old unemployed coal miner I just referred to, or for that matter, a corporate executive, the one thing that white person doesn't want to be told is that they enjoy white privilege. And I wonder, if we look at the other side of the coin now, why do you think it's so difficult for people to identify their own privilege in our society?
Fundamentally, because we haven't been taught about it, one. So that's a big part of the problem. The second thing is that it's really emotional, because as soon as we talk about privilege, it feels like what we're saying is that people didn't work hard. And that's the problem, is that we equate somehow working hard with privilege. And what I want to say really clearly is that everybody has to work hard. If our kids want to graduate from school, it's A to B, it's uphill. If they want to get a job, it's A to B, it's uphill. If they want to get promoted at work, it's A to B, it's uphill. So everyone works hard. What the conversation about privilege says is that when we know something like white-sounding names have a higher chance of callback for interviews, we're just saying that a lot of white people don't know that. And that's invisible privilege. It's like a wind at their back that's kind of helping with the uphill journey. And what we want to be able to do is recognize that everyone, we sort of assume in society incorrectly that everyone who got to B were the ones that worked the hardest. But the problem is that some people had to work 2, 3, 4 times as hard to get to B. And yet that's not acknowledged. And some people might have worked 10 times as hard as everyone else, but didn't get to B because there was so much headwind. They had so much resistance because of their identities and their background. There's mental health issues. There's a single parent. There is multiple jobs that are going on, that the wind kind of broke their sails, and that there's a way in which they didn't get there. So hard work gets to be tricky. And on one level, we intuitively know that. On another level, we have to learn that our identities benefit us. I know my identity as a man, for example, benefits me to be able to talk about leadership things. I get questioned less than, say, a female counterpart does. Just because I was born into a male body means that there's a certain kind of privilege I had to do nothing for. It makes certain things easier. And so whether it's race or gender or sexual orientation or disability, us becoming aware of our identities can actually support us fundamentally in learning to hold our identities lightly and not be so attached to them. But often people get really attached to their identities because there isn't space given. And so what we need to be able to do is just recognize that and step in that paradox of becoming fluid around being able to talk about race and gender and sexual orientation. And in doing so, it can allow us then to not have to hold on to those identities so tightly, which I think often happens.
I guess fundamentally it's an understanding that we're not all born at the same starting line. Some people are actually born at second base or third base.
That's right.
And they've got advantages. Okay. You know, you work in this field of diversity and inclusion training. You've been doing it for many, many years. This is, if I may say, it seems to be a booming industry. There are many corporate HR departments that make diversity training. Some of it's voluntary, but a lot of it's mandatory as well. And I wonder whether you see this as progress that, no pun intended, this is getting on our province's agenda, and therefore we're making strides. What do you think?
In some ways, that's true. The only thing is that, I'm glad for the conversations to happen, but we then have to look at what's the quality of what we're doing and how effective is it? And are we measuring to see if these things make a difference? Or are we just like emotionally making ourselves feel better by doing this. Some organizations just do that. They generally are just like, we need to have a diversity training, and they invite people in, and it's not effective because it's a one-off. But training, if it's one part of a multi-pronged strategy that includes senior leadership, strategic planning, measurement and data, bias filters through all their HR systems, then it can make a difference. And however, right now, whether it's diversity training or anti-racism training, I feel like we're really struggling because they're not all effective. And they can't be effective unless they're part of a multi-pronged process. But even as trainings themselves, for example, if you're mandating training, frequently mandated trainings backfire. People show up with their backs, their shoulders kind of hunched, ready to be scolded. And if that's the way that they leave, you might not have done a better job. And so I think that one of the things that's really needed is again, creating a kind of psychological safety for people to learn. And that's where bringing the emotional awareness is important, and also not just focusing on the historical and the political. And that tends to be how justice work tends to be shared, is it's historical and political. And that's part of the problem, because that's linear. And some of the ways that we teach racial justice work inside organizations or outside organizations tends to be very pedantic and kind of authoritarian in its orientation, whereas we need way more strategies that engage adults using a proven adult-based methodology, but also show up with compassion and the ability to make mistakes. And what we found is that when people do that, people can actually have the conversation that needs to happen, because we can't confront a problem as complex as systemic racism without having an honest conversation about it. And right now, we're not having a lot of honest conversations. People are having very performative conversations. They're doing things because they have to do them, not necessarily because they understand them or believe them. And that fundamentally can just create the conditions for backlash. And I think part of the work that we do is really centering emotions, because emotions aren't an impediment to the work around justice. It is the work. And so I think that we've got to work at that level.
That is a great place to leave this off. Shakil Choudhury, author, Deep Diversity, A Compassionate Scientific Approach to Achieving Racial Justice. It's so good to have you back on our airwaves here at TVO. And thanks for this conversation, which we hope is a bit of a down payment on the work that needs doing going forward.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.